Okay, so I want to talk to you a little bit about who Daniel Guerin was. Just by way of brief biography, as we think about who this figure was. Similar to our reading of Gramsci, we're getting into now like thinking about socialist authors, or in this case, an anarchist author. Um, who was himself actively involved in the struggle against fascism. Daniel Guerin lived from 1903 to 1988. He was himself born into a bourgeois family. A little bit of a similar kind of story to someone like Friedrich Engels, Marx's collaborator, right? So we have this person who plays this kind of incredible outsized role in the workers' movement, who is himself born into a capitalist family. So his family were owners of the Hachette publishing and bookselling firm. And his family included bankers, industrialists, merchants, people of those sorts of occupations. He was raised within the Catholic Church. He was educated in Catholic schools. And this experience actually later inspired his atheism. So he was first drawn by the mysticism, but then later repulsed by the authoritarianism of the Catholic priests. So Guerin spent part of his life as a teenager in Germany, where he lived with a German family in 1921 after the end of World War I. And that experience helped teach him not to have the anti German sentiment that was typical among the French folks that he knew. He was later sent to Beirut in 1927, and at that time it was under the occupation of the French. And it was during this time that his anti-colonialist sensibilities were honed. He later traveled to Vietnam in 1930, and that's where he witnessed firsthand the racist brutality of the French in that region. And when he returned to France that same year, he wrote journalistic articles decrying the occupation of Vietnam and broke ties with his bourgeois family. Um, in addition to his study of fascism, Guerin was also an important proponent of sexual liberation of gay rights. And he was openly bisexual, and he was scorned, he was ostracized by figures within the left movement for that reason, right? So Guerin is one of these figures whom we see having to both intervene against far right, fascist, racist movements, but also, even amongst his own comrades, he had to wage a struggle for human dignity. I think that it is very instructive to think a little bit about Guerin's background, about who Guerin was as an individual and what his experiences were, as we kind of prepare to dig in to thinking about this book, Fascism and Big Business, which is what we are going to do next. Great, so let's talk about chapter one of Fascism and Big Business. What I want to do is put this book into conversation with other texts that we've looked at, especially ones that address the question of what is fascism? What is fascism conceptually? And what is fascism concretely as a historical phenomenon and as a political movement and as an economic strategy? And so we have looked at several authors who have addressed this question, right? Whether it is to talk about what fascism is not, right, and to tell us, reasonably, I think, right, to put forward the notion that, look, it's much easier actually to kind of describe the things that it would be mistaken to attribute to fascism or to categorize fascism as. We've talked about definitions of fascism that are kind of dialectical and dynamic, like what we get in Paxton's The Anatomy of Fascism. Um, but several of our authors have alluded to this Marxist conception of fascism, right? This view that communists have about what fascism amounts to. And so Guerin is again in a similar vein as Gramsci. So let me just pause actually because a moment ago, when I talked about kind of biography of Guerin, I mentioned that he is an anarchist, and so it's worth just sort of speaking briefly to that important distinction between anarchism and communism, with which many of you may be familiar already, right? So the differences are varied and multiple, but I think that most anarchists and most communists would think it's fair to say that the kind of strict distinction between the two can be conceived in terms of their relationship to the state, and in particular to state power. So, communists talk about seizing the state, right? This is part of Marx's program when you look at things like the Communist Manifesto and the kinds of measures that he's advising there, right? He's talking about seizing the means of production, and he thinks that that is going to involve laying hold of the political structures that are in place, right? And seizing political power. Um, Anarchists, on the other hand, tend to be, as the name suggests, relatively skeptical about state power. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily skeptical about all forms of power that exist, right? And that those differences, in part, also kind of track distinctions between different threads of anarchism. But this relationship to state power, right? State power as this centralization of force, right? Of compulsion. When we look at the kinds of conversations that occur within the context of liberal democracy, when we talk about the state, we're talking about this question of what kinds of coercion are legitimate. And so this is what the state is, right? This is part of the essential nature of the state. Communists think that it's important to seize it, to take it over. They think that it is such a important, fundamental kind of organizing structure that it would be a mistake to leave it in the hands of the capitalist class, right? Of the current kind of ruling class. Anarchists say, well, no, it's problematic to try to seize the state and um, try to assume uh, power over the state and use those mechanisms, because their concern is that the state is inherently corrupting, right? So another way to think about this distinction, and we'll come back to just like kind of thinking about Guerin on fascism, but this is important to think about why Guerin talks about fascism in the way that he does. Another way to think about this distinction between anarchists and communists is that they tend to have a differing points of view about the relationship between means and ends. So Marxists think that the ends need not look anything like the means, right? So the means by which we achieve communism may or may not in themselves kind of mirror or prefigure in any direct way the actual society that we want. So when you look at something like Marx's comments about the dictatorship of the proletariat, in some ways it does prefigure a communist society, because a communist society is a society where the people who make society also make the decisions about society. But it just so happens that in a communist society, everyone is kind of involved in this work of making decisions and of being involved in productive labor. You don't have these kinds of economic class divisions of one group who does the work and one group who makes the decisions. That tends to typify productive relations under capitalism. So, in the conditions of a transitional socialist state that is just now seizing state power, Marx talks about a dictatorship of the proletariat. What he means by that is rule of the majority, right? And not just any kind of right, rule of the people that make society happen. Over, right, this now dispossessed capitalist class. On the other hand, right, oftentimes anarchism is associated with more of a kind of what's called prefigurative politics, with this idea that the means by which we achieve this society that is free of coercion, that does allow for individual freedom and for expression and right and all these things that both communists and anarchists want. Anarchists tend to think that the only means that are legitimately used in order to achieve such an end are ends that are themselves non-coercive. Now, as I said, that's a very rough and ready kind of distinction, and there's lots of kind of like overlap between anarchists and communists in practice, especially when we think about the early part of the 20th century and the kind of organizing that was happening in Europe, in the States, right, where lots of people kind of identified as both and, right, and all this stuff. But what I'm describing right now is, pretty widely, going to be like pretty widely accepted as like a reasonable kind of shorthand to think about, well, why would somebody identify as one as opposed to the other? So Guerin's an anarchist. Okay, so let's loop back now, and we're going to talk about what is Guerin's analysis of fascism. And he gives an overview of that in this first chapter. So he opposes it to what he identifies as a kind of rival Marxist analysis or a rival kind of revolutionary analysis in any case, which says that fascism is a movement that rises up as a response to the threat of proletarian revolution. And Guerin says, I'm not so sure. Guerin thinks that that kind of analysis is probably overly flattering to the prospect of revolutionaries in the early part of the 20th century and when fascism was growing. What Guerin thinks is more likely as an explanation, what Guerin thinks did more to kind of motivate the move towards fascism, is the kind of internal failure of capitalism itself, right? So he talks about these kinds of threats that are external to capitalism and these threats that are internal to capitalism. For various reasons, I actually think that's not I think there's reasons to kind of question that framing. But the point is that he thinks that not only did you have the kind of political organization of revolutionaries emerging as a kind of threat to capitalism, right? The idea is that capitalism itself was crisis-ridden in such a way that it was producing its own kind of instability. And that particular instability took the form of the falling rate of profit. And Guerin argues that fascism is a particular kind of political response to the falling rate of profit. as investments become less profitable, Guerin argues, the capitalist class has to squeeze harder in order to extract value from labor. Now, there are certain political structures that in a liberal democracy, right, workers can avail themselves of. And as Guerin says, the way, the extent to which they can avail themselves of those measures is limited, right? They include things like the right to free speech, the right to assemble, right? All of these kinds of liberal rights, right to life, liberty, and property, right? Things like this. And we can do our radical analysis and say, well, these are all a joke and they don't really exist, but they do exist. It's not illegal to print the New York Times. It's not illegal to read it. It's not illegal to sell it, right? It's not illegal to print Jacobin, right? So even as we can acknowledge that these kinds of liberal rights of liberal bourgeois democracy are relatively thin, are kind of, a sham in all kinds of important ways, it would be going way too far, right? It would be very foolish to downplay the fact that they do exist and we do have them. And so Guerin says, okay, so you have this situation where the rate of profit is falling. It is more and more difficult for capitalists to turn a profit on their investments. And that can happen for all kinds of reasons. It can happen, for example, in the presence of some widespread crisis, like a pandemic, right? Right? And so in those circumstances, you now have, right, within a liberal democracy, you have a working class that has some resources with which to defend itself. It can spread, it doesn't even have to be revolutionary ideas, right? It can spread kind of left progressive, right, pro-worker ideas. The working class can strike, right? They can do all kinds of things that are legal, right, within this kind of framework of liberal democracy. Now, why even allow, right, those limited rights in the first place, right? Well, we've read our Gramsci, and so we know the importance of ideological buy-in, right? Under those conditions, it's that much easier to have a working class that is that buys in, right? That's on board with capitalism, right? It's easier to have that kind of society where people don't have to be beaten and maimed and killed, right? All of the things that happen in fascism as ways to extract value, right? And to rid the capitalists, to rid a society of the supposed dead weight of, unproductive eaters, so-called, right? That's hard. It's expensive. It takes a huge apparatus. It offends the sensibilities of even many, right, members of the ruling class, of capitalists, right? They might themselves find it appalling and abhorrent. It's much better and much easier and much more stable to have this society that allows for some liberal rights. But when push comes to shove, this is Guerin's argument, right? When push comes to shove, those liberal rights with which the working class is able to defend itself in normal circumstances, they start to become a liability to the ability of the capitalist class to extract labor from workers. And under those conditions, these rights start to look very dispensable. Now, how do you get working class people to buy into that, right? To buy into these violent attacks on their rights, on their living standards, on their dignity? Of course, you do it in large part, as Gramsci has pointed out for us, through all kinds of ideological priming and indoctrination. But terrorism and violence, right, is an important component of how you achieve this transformation of society that leaves the working class defenseless. And so in chapter 1, right, we have Guerin talk about this kind of mechanism of how these terrorist organizations, right, the Nazi Party grew out of sort of small terrorist bands, paramilitary bands called Freikorps, like Free Corps, right? And they proved themselves, right? They proved themselves in the aftermath of World War I as brutal and effective warriors against socialism. And so in a time of crisis, that is who big business turned to in order to do the work of defeating working class opposition, to losing their rights, to being turned into mere tools for profit. So that's the general argument of chapter 1, right? Which gives this kind of framing of the relationship between fascism and big business in Europe. Okay, so for chapter 3, I want to speak a little bit more briefly to this chapter. Although this is it's very crucial for us, right? So one of the things that we have kind of returned to a number of times throughout the course of the semester so far is the relationship between ideas and matter. And this is essentially the core kind of theme of chapter 3. So chapter 3 is talking about the role of propaganda in the fascist capacity to rally people to their cause. And so again, like asking this question, well, how did they do it? how do you conscript people, or not even conscript, right? How do you attract people to a movement like this? And so Guerin talks about the role of propaganda among the fascists, and in particular to the role of mysticism and irrationalism in fascist ideology. So a core theme of this chapter is the kind of distinction between thinking that you can just simply appeal to economic factors about whether a person has enough to eat or whether they have a home or not, right? I think this is a mistake that people still make today. There's no automatic connection between someone living in dire circumstances or experiencing economic hardship. There's no direct, automatic, mechanical connection between that objective economic circumstance and a progressive, socialist, Marxist, working class ideological response to it. As should be obvious, because lots of people who are in dire economic circumstances are not pulled automatically towards leftism, right? And in fact are won over to racist far right explanations and movements. And so we have to have a theory about what's happening at the level of ideology and at the level of thought, right? And at the level of theory, right? What is happening to encourage people to move ideologically in directions that, by all accounts, are actually counter to their material interests, right? And so Guerin argues that the fascists focus entirely on these kinds of spiritual attractions of fascism. Now, he argues that he says two things about this, right? One is that they do this because what the hell, what else are they going to appeal to? They have to go in an irrationalist direction because reason clearly pulls you in the direction of, if we think that it is in some way inherently rational to want to survive, then reason pulls, the average individual worker not in the direction of fascism, right? So fascist propaganda has to undercut reason as much as possible. And Guerin gives us examples of that happening, right? Of explicit statements from Mussolini, from Goebbels, from Hitler, arguing explicitly that it is an important fascist strategy to appeal to emotion, to appeal to faith, right? Arguing that it's important that fascist ideology be put into the category of religious or kind of quasi-religious belief, right? Why? Because within the kind of habits of religion, people are already primed to believe that which which doesn't flow directly, right, from reason or from empirical observation. So this is the kind of social substrate, right, that fascist ideology piggybacks on, right, and it presents itself as religious in this sense, right, and therefore as the sort of thing that one simply believes without reason and without evidence. We see this in on page 77, right, where Guerin quotes Mussolini, arguing, like he's telling his followers, "You believed in me when nobody else did, and you saw that I could lead you to success, victory, right, right." The idea is that there is a great man, a kind of man of destiny, and his vision is what you substitute for your reason. And because it's his vision, right, it's something that he's not going to be able to spell out in rational terms, certainly not in terms that you're going to be able to evaluate. The only thing you can do is have faith and believe, right, and follow. Now, why does that work, right? Here we come to the second piece of it, right? So I said that Guerin says kind of focuses on two issues here, right? That help to explain why fascist ideology emphasizes just kind of like faith, right, over reason. So one is, if you're being rational, you're not going to want to do these horrible things, right? And the other is, Guerin thinks, is that people have spiritual needs. They just do, right? He says, like, look, people that the thing that fascism is getting right is that people are not merely their stomachs, right? They want to be part of something larger. You can think about this in connection with the question of alienation, right? And alienation is an objective reality, right, about the relationship that we have or don't have to the products of our labor. But it does also describe a kind of subjective felt psychological phenomenon, right? And so what Guerin says here is that, look, the fascists are actually correctly naming that people have this desire to belong, to be part of something, right? To have their kind of spiritual needs met. And Guerin thinks that in that sense, they won, the fascists just kind of had better propaganda. They were able to speak to this better. So, okay, I want to talk about what that irrationality, right? What that kind of faith driven, follow the man of destiny driven, kind of what that looked like, right? In detail, right? So there's 5 main features. You could probably detail more in this chapter, but there's 5 main features that I want to speak to. One, page 76, Guerin talks about prioritizing spiritual sustenance over material needs, right? So encouraging people to sacrifice. Why would you do that? Because fascism is not about satisfying the material needs of workers. It's about extracting as much economic value out of them as possible and leaving them as little as possible, right? So, but what it can give is this kind of sense that you're part of the nation, you're part of the fatherland, right? Page 80, the cult of the dead, right? This idea of that it is a death cult, that it valorizes death. You see this in a number of the writings, a number of the speeches, that the sacrifice of one's life is held up as a kind of highest value. Life is really sort of diminished and degraded in value, and but this kind of like rush towards death, and the idea that dying is the kind of noblest thing one can do, right? Which also fits in with things we've talked about earlier, like when we've read Mussolini actually earlier on in the semester and talked about the kind of love of war and the idea of just like permanent war, and war as the highest human activity, right? So that of course goes hand in hand with valorizing death. The cult of youth, right? This kind of like emphasis on like this sort of like the physical strength and power, right? But what is youth also associated with, right? I mean, it's associated with people, the longer we live, if all goes well, the more we know, the more we understand, the more we see of history, the more we understand how things unfold, the more we know about the world we're in, right? So why would the fascist movement have a cult of youth? Well, a number of reasons. Like I said, this kind of like cult of the body and all these kinds of things. But also, it's just associated with kind of greater naivete, right? And who needs reason? Who needs observation, right? And then the cult of the war veteran, right? And especially when we think about someone like Mussolini again, or Hitler, right? Also a veteran. And bring that, and kind of like the larger kind of love of war, right? So who better to lead these fascist movements. The last bit that I want to say about chapter 3 is to speak to Guerin's observation. This comes on page 83, that fascist ideology demonstrates a scorn of the masses, right? It does not seek, like socialism does, right, to try to raise the theoretical level of the masses. The idea is it's a very kind of goal-oriented, mechanical, like we just going to tell them whatever we have to tell them to get them to do X, Y, and Z, right? A total kind of disdain and disrespect for the intellect of the people. So these are some of the kinds of key elements, right, that Guerin is describing in chapter 3. And this is what he means when he describes the ideology of fascism as a fascist mysticism. Okay, so we are now making our way to chapter 4, where we'll talk about what Guerin calls fascist demagogy. And here the sort of central question is, okay, so we have this discussion of how fascism appeals to the spiritual needs of people, but Guerin says it has to somehow address the actual material privations that people are experiencing. And it does this, right? Remember, of course, in Germany, it's called National Socialism, right? And in Italy as well, right? It's called fascism, and what fascism meant, right? What fascism amounts to, we all know that it refers to this kind of grouping of sticks, right? That are weak by themselves, but very strong together, very hard to break if you put them all together. What are the sticks in fascist theory in Italy? Well, the classes, right? It's the idea that the thing that fascism is opposed to is class conflict, right? Is the idea of kind of spelling out, describing, and even intensifying the divisions in society, which is the thing that communism seeks to do, right? And so Mussolini has this idea of fascism, and the notion here is to attempt to somehow co-opt, right, some of the frustrations and economic and working class demands that are represented, that are expressed in a socialist movement, right? So fascist movements have to kind of do this sleight of hand, right? They have to masquerade as working class movements, right? Or at least as movements that can authentically represent and fight for working class aspirations, right? Okay. So, what is one of the things that makes fascism distinct from traditional capitalist parties? So we talked a little bit about this back in thinking about chapter 1 and about fascism's relationship to liberal rights, right? But another key aspect is the way that fascism has to put on this performance of so-called, or according in Guerin's terms, demagogic anti-capitalism. Fascism has to put on a show of anti-capitalism, right? So fascism does this, right, by diverting popular anti-capitalist anger to the international plutocracy and to anti-Semitism, right? So in the examples that we're looking at, which is not to say that contemporary or future kind of instances of fascism, were they to occur, could not rely on some other form of racism, right? And like identity-based oppression, bias, and division. So consider Carl Schmitt, whom we read a couple weeks ago, right? Consider Carl Schmitt, consider Goebbels' claim, socialism can be achieved only in opposition to the Jews, right? Notice how that obviously takes, right, a socialist demand and converts it into racist anti-Semitism. Um, or Guerin's description of Goebbels as someone who believed he must kill or be killed, right? So all of a sudden we have this kind of like murderous racism, right? But socialism is getting kind of mushed together with it, right? Now, its hostility to fascism's hostility to the sort of big bourgeoisie, it's not actually a hostility to the bourgeoisie as such. Fascism is not hostile to the existence of a bourgeoisie. It is hostile to specific members of the bourgeoisie who it argues must be replaced with fresh blood, right, from the petty bourgeoisie. The petty bourgeoisie, remember, is small business. Guerin here in his analysis, right, he's following a kind of Marxist class analysis. So when we talk about capitalists and big business, we're talking about large-scale owners of the means of production. We're talking about, as Guerin refers to again and again, he's thinking specifically of what he calls heavy industry, right? People that control gas, right? Who control steel, right? Who on like a massive scale control the things that a society needs in order to continue existing, right, as itself, right, as a modern society at all. When we talk about the petty bourgeoisie, we're talking about small business. We're talking about restaurant owners, hotel owners, like these are small businesses. If they go under, it's very bad, right? Or it's unfortunate in all kinds of ways. But we're not talking about we're not talking about the people who individually have the capacity to just like grind the society to a halt, right? Right? Or who just like can kind of have this massive outsized control. Okay, so that's big bourgeoisie. I should correct it. It's not total. I mean, whether the big bourgeoisie actually has the power to grind society to a halt, I think is not totally clear. But my point being, they have this particular kind of economic control over the resources. So, insofar as fascism kind of like gives this little nod to being critical of big business, and insofar as it's not in opposition to big business as such, but just thinks that certain big businesses should go, especially the ones run by the targeted minority, right? And insofar as it thinks that some of those positions of like kind of control and leadership should be occupied by current members of the petty bourgeoisie, which, by the way, in a case of economic crisis, is in great danger of being proletarianized, right? That is to say, of sinking back into the ranks of the working class. Fascism is able to make itself very popular with petty bourgeois. So I want us to think about Gramsci, right, in this context. So Gramsci says, remember he talked about when we last got together and we talked about Gramsci, just arguing that Caesarist solutions seek a restoration that ultimately, however, is unreasonable at best, right? Because he says it is certain that in the movement of history there is never any turning back, and that restorations in toto do not exist. So that was page 464 of the prison notebooks. And if you remember, it's one of my kind of favorite passages that I like to think about. Think about this in connection with Guerin, right, who cites a Nazi remarking, "National Socialism wants to stop the automatic movement of the capitalist wheel, put a brake on it, then make it turn back to its starting point and stabilize it there. This is Guerin quoting a Nazi figure, right? National Socialism wants to stop the automatic movement of the capitalist wheel, put a brake on it, then make it turn back to its starting point and stabilize it there. I'm just going to come right out and say nothing could be more irrational, right? And irrational precisely in the way that Gramsci pointed to, right? There's never any turning back. There's certainly not the kind of like turning back and then just reaching this point of like utter stagnation, right? Where history just stops and stays put. But think about this in connection with what we talked about earlier about fascism's inherent irrationality. Okay, so think here of the kind of theory of history that's at work in an aim like that, and of the irrationalism inherent, right, in the aim and in the theory of history. So there's three promises of corporatism. This is page 101 in the Guerin. One, that workers will be deproletarianized. Two, that independent petty bourgeois will not be proletarianized and their economic position will be stabilized. And three, that there will be a corporate state in which all producers will have a voice. So fascism draws on reactionary and reformist solutions to the economic crisis. However, one, fascists want to set up corporatism in the form of an authoritarian, not a democratic political state. And two, fascists want fascist trade unions, not free ones. Remember, when we talk about corporatism here, we're not talking about a corporation. Corporatism in the sense that instead of having class conflicts and divisions, they are all conceived of as part of one body, right? One corporate form, right? Entity. And so they should all kind of like work together. And this means that the trade unions, instead of having independent organization, they are themselves brought under the control of the state. Now, in theory, the state is supposed to be neutral with respect to the different classes. Of course, in practice, that's not the case. So one way to think about what fascism is doing then, right, is it is seeking to bring the working class under the direct political leadership of the bourgeoisie and deny them the possibility of independent political organization and representation. So to this point, Guerin quotes Mussolini, right, saying, "Present political representation cannot suffice for us. We want direct representation of all interests," right? So again, right, arguing against the current kind of liberal forms of political representation that existed, and arguing that instead of having these kinds of competing parties, you should have everything brought in under the form of one party in one state, right, without the ability to have independent organizing, right? So the 1919 fascist program in Italy, it called for, and this is a quote from Guerin, the creation of national technical councils of labor, industry, transportation, etc., elected by the entire profession or trade, right? But again, all under the framework of one state, right? And one party. Okay. So that's all right. So there's this kind of like overture made to to the working class, right? This overture made to the petty bourgeoisie as well, right? Like, look, like, you are now going to be represented within government. You are not going to be on the outside looking in. You're going to be part of the state. Right, we're going to have this corporate state structure, and you're going to be in it. And now the state is going to be neutral with respect to class. It is no longer. This is the promise of. This is the kind of propaganda of fascism, right? That you're no longer going to have a state that just represents the capitalist class against the other classes. Now they're all brought into the state. So isn't that good, right? Doesn't that mean that we now have universal representation all as members of one nation, right? Or one folk, right? Um, okay, so that's the propaganda, that's the ideology, but you won't be surprised to find that behind the scenes it works very differently. And so, of course, right, the big capital is completely hostile to this. Why would they want that? Right? They don't want this to happen. They don't want a state that's obviously, right, a state that's just neutral, um, as among the competing interests of different classes, right? So Guerin argues that, of course, behind the scenes, the big capital is totally hostile to corporatism, and corporatism is a ruse at best, right? But it's a ruse that speaks to the material interests, right? At least ostensibly speaks to the material interests of the classes that the fascist state seeks to involve, right? And kind of bring on board. So in this way, and now we're getting to pages 113 and 114, right? In this way, fascism is able to maintain its illusion of being actually socialist. And it manages to maintain its illusion of claiming to be friendly to workers' management of production. And it even is able to maintain its illusion of offering a fundamental transformation of property rights, all while, in practice, right, utterly destroying any real political representation of the working class. So that brings us to chapter 7, which is the last chapter of Guerin's Fascism and Big Business that we will discuss together. And so chapter 7, which is titled The Real Fascist Doctrine, right? So the idea here is, he's kind of traced the story of how fascism emerges as a movement and how it brings people on board, right? But then, like, as it kind of reaches a maturity as a ruling element, right? You get to see in more kind of fleshed out, right, what it really amounts to. So Guerin argues that in the form of fascism, you have the bourgeoisie rejecting and wiping out its own intellectual heritage. He argues that fascism is a kind of twin of feudalism, the very thing that the bourgeoisie rose up in opposition to and overthrew, right? Now we see this kind of like the historical backwardness that we talked about, this desire to like roll things back and stop them at this earlier historical point, the hatred of individual rights, of liberalism, the hatred of reason. All of these things, Guerin argues, makes fascism this kind of full-throated realization of the same kind of reactionary elements that capitalism it was supposed to have historically overthrown, but never really finished the job and continued to contain, right, some of that irrationality within it. So again here, right, I want to point out the kind of wild theory of history that the fascists are working with. So Guerin, right, so, the Nazis proclaim the year 1789 will be erased from history. This is, I mean, this is, it's almost like obvious and kind of simplistic to point out that no such thing could ever happen, but it's worth saying, because it points out, it helps us to identify just like the utter um, yeah, irrationality, the kind of like deep flight from reality, um, from humanity, from history, from progress, right? From any kind of contact with the real world and how it operates. You can't wipe 1789 from history, but they're going to try. Um, And so, in the figure of fascism, you have the bourgeoisie renouncing progress and reason. Now, now keep in mind, right, the thought here being that reason points us forward to a different kind of society based on satisfying human needs, right? That if people were, give people the opportunity to exercise their reason and to organize society in a rational manner. And it's not going to be a society that sacrifices the masses in order to accumulate profits for a very small few who, by the way, aren't even going to be able to enjoy it that much longer because we're in the process of destroying the earth. Right? That's irrational. That makes no sense. And so what Guerin is working with and what socialist opponents of fascism, right, are working with, right, is this idea that reason points forward towards a society based on human needs, based on real democracy, right, and based on real individual freedom, right? The real ability of human beings to flourish, right? And to develop themselves and to live their lives, not enslaved to either as chattel slaves, right? Or as uh, wage laborers, or as slaves in a Nazi concentration camp. That's irrational. And so fascist ideology is tied to the irrational. So Guerin writes, this is on page 195, he says, "A day comes when liberty and democracy are incompatible with bourgeois rule. The era of free competition is succeeded by that of monopoly capitalism. In order to save their profits threatened by crisis, the capitalist magnates need the support of the state," right? And it's under these conditions, again, think back to where we began the discussion, right? We're talking about how Guerin thinks of fascism as a kind of strategy of large capital in conditions of economic crisis where the rate of profit starts to fall and liberal rights are an impediment to extracting as much value out of labor as possible, right? And keeping those profits buoyed up. So this is chapter 7 is where we're ending, right, with our discussion of this book. Um, it's worth thinking about other conditions, perhaps, where we see, even the kinds of protections of the rights that people have in a kind of liberal bourgeois capitalist democracy, right, where even those, limited as they might be in all kinds of ways, they're valuable. We want them. We don't want to be without them in the presence of a capitalist economy, right? And so let's think, right, about those themes that Guerin is identifying for us, right, of these kinds of moments of crisis and these turning points where we have to decide, right? Do we build on the political advances that have been achieved already throughout history? Do we take the advances brought by capitalism and by the bourgeoisie at a particular moment in history, and do we seek to build on them and extend them further and have greater freedom, right? And greater enjoyment of the material resources that allow for good and fulfilling and flourishing human life, right? Or will we be dragged backwards?